welcome to the last of the recordings on Roman women. We're going to look at the reality of Roman women and hairdressing and education and divorce and how it worked in the real world. Let's go talk a little bit about real Roman women, not just from Tacitus. We know that women were in charge of education for their children, in charge of both young boys and girls, particularly until they hit ages somewhere between 7 and 10. They taught their children reading and writing, culture of Rome, history of Rome, some geography, we think. They also taught the girls domestics. They would have been taught these things. Now, notice this. It's not the exceptional woman who's learning to read and write in Rome. All of them are supposed to know how to read and write. Okay? And we're going to see that exemplified in a couple of ways. Citizenship in Rome applied to both men and women. And now, remember when we talked about this with Athens, is that Athens has to, after the trial of Neaera and some of what goes on with Pericles and Aspasia, we see the Athenians pass a citizenship law that in the 451 that raises the status of citizen women in Athens. Well, in Rome, they were all citizens to begin with, both men and women. Now, could the men do things the women couldn't? Yes. And could they be oppressive? Sure. But we got to be careful there, okay? Because one man's trash is another man's treasure. Women could testify in court, and did. They could bring suit in court under certain circumstances. And we're going to talk about guardianship and the family in the next video. It was thought that it was unseemly for a woman to testify in court. And it didn't mean she couldn't, and it didn't mean her testimony wouldn't be valid. It just means they didn't really like it, okay? Women have, as I mentioned, lots of freedom of movement in Rome. Whereas in Athens, citizen wives are going to be very confined. They're there for certain processions, certain religious things, but they don't move out and about in Rome. And they out and about in Athens, and they do in Rome constantly. They are involved in economic life, much like what we saw in Egypt and even amongst the Hebrews. We see that here with Rome. They are there at the festivals. They're there at the Roman baths. They may or may not be there at the games. Going to the games was considered very, very bloodthirsty, and you're going to see few women at it. Though there will be some, as we'll see. They are involved in business, particularly the lower class women. Upper class women will be involved in being patrons of institutions. Rome runs on what we call the patron-client system, where the upper classes have clients who they give support to, find jobs for, all kinds of things that the client gives the patrons political support in the Senate in Rome and in any elections and various things that they need. Women were not patrons of individuals, but they were patrons of groups, of labor unions, of guilds, of temples, of building projects. They could back political candidates and did, okay? They are heavily involved in lots of things. We see mothers campaigning for candidates on a regular basis. These women are everywhere. We have inscriptions from Pompeii, the city that's covered by the volcanic ash, that show how very much involved they are. One of them is Nymphodotus, along with Caprasia, ask you to vote for Marcus Quirinius Vitae for the idealship. In other words, Caprasia and Nymphodotus are campaigning for Marcus over here. And we find another on inside of a wine shop. We've got a painting that is saying, vote for this candidate. Their version of billboards, okay, an advertisement. And the ones who are taking out the ads are the women, okay. So they are heavily involved in these sorts of things. We see this very key. Livy tells us a story of during the Punic Wars, the wars between Carthage and Rome. These, what were known as the Oppian Laws. These Oppian Laws are going to be ones that try to limit buying of expensive items, and because they felt we were spending too much money on luxuries, and that was going to be an offense to gods, and we're going to lose the war because of it, and so we need to keep going and not do that. Okay. Well, um, the law is put into place, but the women don't approve of it, and we see women pouring into the forum about 20 years after this law is passed and saying enough, and they were going to convince their male relatives to repeal it. Okay. They are in the forum protesting, these upper class Roman women. Okay. Now, we are not going to see this in Athens. It might have in Sparta, but really, this is not something the Greek world does by and large. Okay. This is a very difficult. Cato is going to go, what kind of behavior is this? Running around in public, blocking streets, and talking to other women's husbands. It is not right. Even if you, in your own homes, are for you to concern yourselves about laws which would be passed or repealed. But Cato's upset that the law was abolished and the women won. It was a scandal in the families. They wanted to leave things off limits to women, but they don't really do it successfully usually. We see other noted women who are going to push their men into what they do. Cornelia, who is going to be the mother of the Gracchi brothers, is going to be extolled by her sons on her monument, and on her funeral monument, and she is going to be the one who helps them on to greatness, helps them push them into political careers, and helps fund them. And we see this multiple times, and we'll talk a little bit in the next lecture about Cicero's wife, who's going to be very critical in all of this. We see the same kind of relationship between Portia and Brutus in the time of Julius Caesar, that Portia is very much involved in Brutus's life. She warns him not to do certain things. He does them anyhow, much to his greater chagrin. Women were heavily involved, but what their involvement is almost always inarticulate power. Even assembling in the Roman Forum is about inarticulate power. Of really, do you want to cross us this badly? How much grief do you want to cause yourself at home by messing with us? Okay. I want to give you one really clear example of Roman women. I love this set here, and we're going to talk a little bit about their hairstyles here in a moment. But the reality of Roman women is best illustrated by the one particular woman by the name of Terentia. Now, there are other named women in Rome, lots of them that we could talk about. But Terentia is actually a wealthy, well-educated plebeian, so she's not the top tier. And she marries without hand at age 18 to Cicero. Cicero is going to be the most prominent orator of late Rome, but the reason for his career is in large part his marriage to Terentia, who is this woman right here. She's the sole inheritor of her father's estate. Notice, a woman can inherit, very much so in Rome. Her half-sister becomes a Vestal Virgin and is incredibly powerful. This is a really powerful family. And we think that from what we can tell, Terentia was the older sister, and she has a huge dowry. She's going to eventually inherit the entirety of the state. Her dowry is 400,000 sesterces, which was the amount needed to run for senator. You had to have that much property. There was a property qualification. Notice what's happened. Cicero needs money to run for senator, and she provides it. And then when her father dies, she receives a huge inheritance. And she owns at least 2 blocks worth of tenement apartments in Rome, and a plot of woods in the suburbs of Rome, and a large farm. She's very wealthy, much more so than he was. She was in charge of the religious aspects of the household. We see these women were the educators, as we talked about, as well as they are the religious kind of center of this. She has tremendous influence on the family fortunes. She shapes Cicero's speeches. There's lots of evidence of that. She owns land in her own name, and as well as the public land that I mentioned. She acquires more land during the marriage. She eventually owns a village that she was about to sell in terms of while Cicero is exiled. Now, Cicero's exile did actually not deprive him of citizenship at this point, because it's very much a political kind of maneuver here. But it strained a lot of things, and eventually the couple divorces. The proceedings take about a year, between 47 and 46 BC. She's 52 at this point. Cicero will remarry, and Terentia does not, though. She remains a sui juris and, quite frankly, the manager of a vast estate. The couple has a daughter by the name of Tullia, who is, actually, this is Terentia and this is Tullia here. She's their only daughter. She actually marries 3 times. Where the first, Tullia's first husband dies, she marries again, and the second one she divorces. We're not really certain why. We don't have a real good record, but we know that the third husband she chooses herself, and she has a lot of influence even on the second one. She convinces her mother, and she and her mother convince Cicero, and Cicero complains about this heavily, and he says, fine, just marry whoever you want to. I'm done. Okay. Her mother is the one making the payments on the dowry, not Cicero, because he has more money by the time of the divorce than he did when they got married, but still most of the property is Terentia's. Her marriage to Dolabella, the third husband, went very, very badly. Even though she picked the dude, this is actually kind of one of those morality tales for Rome that, girls choosing their own husbands usually ends badly. Because look what happened to Tullia. Dolabella is abusive. Eventually, she dies in childbirth. Her death in childbirth basically breaks Cicero. He is devastated by the loss of his child, and his second wife is highly unsympathetic to the fact that he's just lost his only child. And her lack of sympathy, Cicero divorces her. There is a legend of a perpetual lamp that is kept burning for Tullia. And Terentia, by the way, lives to about, if you'll notice, she lives a very long time. She is going to live to almost about 102. She is going to be well off, do very well for herself to the end of her life. Cicero, on the other hand, is going to die well before she does, partly because of all of the political upheavals of the period. One of the things that kind of symbolized who the women were had to do with hair. And this is a potent symbol of Rome's day, was the hairstyle. Hairstyles indicated gender, they indicated social status. Hairstyles indicated kind of who you were on the pecking order. Men had very short hairstyles, usually tried to cover bald hairs with, Caesar does this with a laurel wreath because he doesn't want to show off his bald spots. Barbershops were very typical for men. They became places kind of like we think of them now being, where gossip was exchanged for a man's barbershop. Barbershops tended to hair and beards and nails for men, fingernail clippings, even feet care sometimes, or plucking out unwanted body hairs sometimes for men, but primarily beards, hair, and nails. Upper class women used hairdressers, who were known as the ornatrix, and these hairdressers were all very, very well off. Often these ornatrix, and this is kind of one of these weird things about Rome, is these are going to be paid very well, but they are also usually slaves. Now, this is a weird piece. Part of what's going on here is that these women that you see dressing the hair, this is an incredibly involved process. These hairdressers would be paid well, but and often did not live in anybody else's house. They had someone and who was their owner, but often these hairdressers lived in their own homes. They could have bought their freedom, but if they buy their freedom, then they have to pay taxes, which are really exorbitant in Rome. They make their owners lots of money, so there's lots of these kinds of pieces involved here. Upper class women wore elaborate braided hairstyles, which is kind of what you see Paul referring to in 1 Timothy 2:9. He talks to women of don't let your beauty come from outward adornments of braided hair. Now, we hear braids, and we hear, unless we hear, basic braids like Anna in Frozen, okay? The African American community, black women sometimes braid their hair in rather elaborate styles. That's closer. That kind of braiding that many black women do, that's very, very elaborate, is closer to what we're dealing with here. But I want to show you a short video here that shows you a little bit about what's going on, because the braiding of the hairstyles here is not just about, oh, I look nice today. It's a whole other level.
Ornatrix is the Latin word for hairdresser. Hairstyles are the most distinctive feature of ancient Roman portraits. A passage in a work by the Latin author Festus reveals that these elaborate hairstyles were not crafted using bent wire pins as we do today, but instead were sewn together using needle and thread. Many needle artifacts survive from antiquity. Those suitable for hairdressing are long, with blunted points and larger diameters. It is not the needle that holds the hairstyle in place, but the thread. Bodkins, also known as single-prong hairpins, are one of the oldest hairdressing technologies. They were used as parting tools and to fasten hairstyles in place. Most hair bodkins were carved from wood or bone. Some were made from precious materials and set with gems. Hair bodkins were probably the most common hair support used by plebeian Roman and slave women. Hair bodkins provide good support and decoration for simple bun hairstyles that can be dressed by the wearer herself. For more elaborate Roman styles, the hair bodkin was used by an ornatrix to part and control hair as she dressed it.
There was a tremendous amount of time and expense spent on the hair. And part of what Paul's talking about in 1 Timothy 2:9, he's not saying you shouldn't braid your hair, okay? This is not what he says. He also doesn't say don't wear gold jewelry. He says that shouldn't be your point. And he's doing this deliberately because for many Roman women, that was exactly the point. Your braided hair denoted your status, and they spent a tremendous amount of time and money on it. Lower class women still put their hair up, but it was very simple, and it was done by themselves. And what Paul is urging them to do is you need to be focused on God's kingdom, not on adorning oneself. Okay? Grooming had tremendous symbolism in Rome. Women were rebuked for wearing makeup or too much makeup, but not for coiffures or the time they spent in front of mirrors doing this. Tombstones show women getting their braiding and coiffures done. They were a sign of status and literacy. If you had your hair done like this, you were not just upper class, but you were educated. This was an equivalency to literacy. Now, when we talk about braided hair, this is the kind of elaborate braid we mean. Now, notice here what we've got is this elaborate curly thing that they've done here, which has to be done, as well as this here. Now, as you saw in the video, this is not being pinned together, it's being sewn together. Imagine how long that takes. No respectable woman of any status was going to be found in public with unbound hair because it lacked civilization. It lacked cultus. It was not proper. Cultus means civilized. And it meant you were a barbarian. Very, very few statues survive with unbound hair. One of them is this one here. This is known as the Borghese sarcophagus. And many scholars think she's probably commissioned this because she was mourning her own death. And that's why her hair is shown unbound. But even then, there's still some elaborate curling going on, which would have meant that it had to have been decorated and done up. Women had potent symbols of who they were and who they wanted to be, and one of those was hairstyles. Thanks for watching, folks, and we'll see you on the next one on Christianity.